One of the things that distinguish man from the animals is the power of speech. While it is true that most animals and birds can utter cries which indicate emotion, anger, fear, affection, nevertheless, their range of sounds is very limited, so that they are not capable of expressing more complicated emotions. On the other hand, man can express a very wide range of ideas and emotions through speech. Words are only symbols to which special values and meanings have become attached by general agreement. The same object, consisting of printed pages and a cover, is called by a French speaker, livre, by an English speaker, book, and by a Hindi speaker, kitab. The object is the same in each case, but in each linguistic community a different word to describe it has been agreed upon. Other symbols may be used instead of linguistic ones. A red light is used to indicate danger. A policeman's upheld hand tells us to stop. A forefinger held to the lips warns us to be quiet, but these substitutes are fairly few in number, and therefore cannot be used, except in very limited circumstances. Nutrition, which depends on food, is also of utmost importance in the cure of disease. The primary cause of disease is a weakened organism, or lowered resistance in the body, arising from the adoption of a fully nutritional pattern. There is an elaborate healing mechanism within the body, but it can perform its functions only if it is abundantly supplied with all the essential nutritional factors. Human cell need at least 45 chemical components and elements. Each of these 45 substances, called essential nutrients, must be present in an adequate diet. The nutrients include oxygen and water. The other 43 essential nutrients are classified into 5 groups: carbohydrates, fats, proteins, minerals, and vitamins. All 45 of these nutrients are vitally important, and they work together. Therefore, the absence of any may result in disease, eventually death.
Some ecotourism offers visitors close encounters with different species, but new research suggests that these activities may not be so great for the animals. Researchers tagged stingrays in Stingray City in the Cayman Islands to monitor their movements and behavior. Compared to stingrays outside of the tourism area, those in Stingray City switched their activity patterns from night to day when tourists handed out food, and mated year-round instead of seasonally. The stingrays also had more bite marks, which suggests increased aggression towards one another. The study is in the journal PLOS One. Past research has found increased stress and more intra- and interspecies aggression among animals that have been fed by humans. Interactive tourism is a growing business, but researchers say that more study is needed to ensure the health and safety of humans and animals alike. Ecotourism may be good for a given species as humans become engaged in its survival, but for the individual members of that species tasked with dealing with people, it may not be a walk in the park.
Now, millions of roses get handed out on Valentine's Day, but growing roses has an environmental impact worse than many other crops. Start with climate change. Most roses in the US and Europe are imported from warmer climes. All that flying and trucking adds thousands of metric tons of carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. Then there's all the water needed to, well, water the flowers, and the runoff fouled by copious quantities of pesticides needed to make the roses look perfect. There's also the wildlife and workers poisoned by all that fumigation. Add to that habitat destruction where floral plantations displace native forest and wetlands. Finally, there's the refrigeration needed to keep those blooms fresh. The electricity is often produced by burning fossil fuels, and the refrigerant gases also exacerbate climate change. A more sustainable and possibly more romantic approach is to go with flowers certified by outfits like Veriflora, or even better, whatever flowers are in season locally. Of course, that's not much help for those of us in wintry climes. Maybe try writing a poem. Let's see. Roses are red, violets are blue.
We have ignition. We have liftoff.
Let's say you've saved up 200 grand for a trip to space with Virgin Galactic. Lucky you. But are you healthy enough to fly? You'll have to talk with your doctor. A new study in the BMJ outlines the role that general practitioners will have to play in commercial spaceflight. After all, astronauts typically have to be in tip-top shape, but opening the door to the paying public means that less healthy individuals will soon have access to space too. And the stress of spaceflight, combined with the negative effects of weightlessness on muscle and bone, could cause real problems. It may be up to your personal physician to make the go, no-go call based on your medical history. Among the potential hypotheticals floated in the BMJ study, can my patient with stable angina and a pacemaker for complete heart block participate in a suborbital Virgin Galactic flight? What is the maximum allowable time that my patient with osteoporosis can spend on a planned vacation at a space hotel? There are no official answers, yet, but the study's authors note that such questions may be in the air, or lack thereof, in the not-too-distant future.
If you think about light bulbs, they're an enormous infrastructure. They're in every building in the world, more or less. They have kind of a privileged position above us, around us. They can see, if you think about it, most parts of any room. The kind of key was to say, well, what if we consider a light bulb not to be a light bulb, but actually to be a digital projector? It just happens to be really low resolution. In fact, it's a 1 by 1 pixel digital projector. Turn on the wall switch, and a giant pixel comes out and paints your room. Okay, well, that's ludicrous, but what if you put a higher resolution projector inside that same familiar glass bulb? Well, now you have a device that can illuminate if you turn on all the pixels the same color. You still have a light bulb in the usual sense. But if you turn on the pixels different amounts and different colors, then you're kind of projecting information out into the world. And if at the same time that you're doing that, you put a little tiny camera inside the bulb, then not only is information flowing out of the glass, but you're collecting optical information. So screw one of those into every one of these fixtures, and suddenly you have a means, potentially, to put display and interaction everywhere throughout the world.
A short story is a piece of prose fiction that can be read in one sitting. Emerging from earlier oral storytelling traditions in the 17th century, the short story has grown to encompass a body of work so diverse as to defy easy characterization. At its most prototypical, the short story features a small cast of named characters, and focuses on a self-contained incident with the intent of evoking a single effect or mood. In doing so, short stories make use of plot, resonance, and other dynamic components to a far greater degree than is typical of an anecdote, yet to a far lesser degree than a novel. While the short story is largely distinct from the novel, authors of both generally draw from a common pool of literary techniques. Short stories have no set length. In terms of word count, there is no official demarcation between an anecdote, a short story, and a novel. Rather, the form's parameters are given by the rhetorical and practical context in which a given story is produced and considered, so that what constitutes a short story may differ between genres, countries, eras, and commentators. The short story has been considered both an apprenticeship form preceding more lengthy works, and a crafted form in its own right, collected together in books of similar length, price, and distribution to novels. Short story writers may define their works as part of the artistic and personal expression of the form.
I want to look now at the three main approaches historians have taken towards the English Revolution, or Civil War. There is a fourth point of view, taken up by most school children when they first meet the subject, but it can hardly be called historical. On the one hand, school children tend to have a romantic image of the Cavaliers, who were supporters of the monarchy, as aristocratic, charming, flashily dressed, and up for a bit of fun. On the other hand, they tend to regard the Roundheads or Puritans, who were followers of Oliver Cromwell, as miserable, working class, dressed in black, and insisting on a life without luxuries. It isn't difficult then to take sides. The first approach, which prevailed up until the middle of the 20th century, was that the revolution was part of the age-old battle between Parliament and the monarchy, with Parliament representing the traditional rights of Englishmen against the attempt by the royal family to increase its power and dictate law. In reaction to this, The second approach saw it as a working class revolution and an important stage in the development of capitalism. In other words, they saw it as a class war and a forerunner of the French Revolution and those that came after. Historians who supported the third approach saw that things weren't as clear-cut as the others thought. Instead of seeing the revolution as the result of long-term trends in the country's history, and therefore almost unavoidable, they focused on the details of the period immediately leading up to its outbreak and allowed for its unpredictability. The two sides also weren't so clear-cut, with some aristocrats supporting Parliament and some members of the working class fighting on the side of the monarchy. How did I get into anthropology? Well, I'm not an anthropologist, not trained in it anyway. In fact, I'm a marine biologist, and it's more that I'm interested in the strandlopers, the beach walkers, if you like, than in anthropology generally. In fact, it was through my early interest in all things to do with the sea that I first heard of them. As a kid, my favourite pastime was getting down to the beach and mucking about in rock pools and collecting anything the sea tossed up, and, the strandlopers lived off the sea and seashore, gathering food such as mussels, oysters, crabs and so on, just as I did. So when I heard of them, I thought, right, this is my kind of thing, and I felt a kind of, affinity for them. At first, people thought they were a myth, I suppose because there didn't seem to be much evidence for their existence. But now we do have archaeological evidence such as pottery, discarded shells, the bones of seals and large fish and so on. And those shells, we believe, became their first tools, and in some cases were also used as money and jewellery. Of course, before they had the implements, the tools to hunt and fish, everything had to be caught by hand, so they kept mostly to shallow water. Then they might have used a primitive form of fishing line, perhaps the tendril of a climbing plant or a strip of animal skin with a bone or small piece of wood that would stick in the fish's throat. Anyway, the more we search, the more we discover. Most recently, caves on the coast have been discovered with ancient drawings. I find it endlessly fascinating.
Randall Jarrell, the great American critic and poet, once defined the novel as an extended piece of prose fiction with something wrong with it. Now, nothing is perfect, and you don't have to look very hard to find something wrong, or perhaps just something you don't like, about any work of fiction you care to name. Where, we might ask, does the editor come into this? And is it beneficial to an author to have an editor who is also a novelist? You would think that being a writer themselves, familiar with the process of writing a novel and its demands, they would be able to get inside the head of the author and be sympathetic and understanding of what needs to be done. This is not an unreasonable assumption to make. However, is it not possible that there is an opposite side to this? Editors might, from their experience as writers, possibly unconsciously try to make over the submitted novel as they themselves would have written it. The ideal, one supposes, is for the editor to see the book through the author's eyes, but if they apply their own creative talent to the job, they might end up seeing it too much through their own eyes, and, in this way, take no account of the author's original intentions.
It is claimed by neuroscientists, among others, that speaking 2 or more languages increases cognitive abilities and in some way rewires the brain, as it were, in a way that positively affects how the brain works. And it's true that we tend to think of people who can speak 2 or more languages as being bright. Learning a language is, anyway, good mental exercise, not to mention its benefits in introducing you to other peoples and cultures. This is why all school curricula should include at least one compulsory foreign language. Anyone who knows 2 languages will find that in certain circumstances they compete for position, the vocabulary of one getting in the way of the other. Often, bi- or multilingual people find one language more suitable for expressing certain kinds of thoughts or feelings. There is another view on being bilingual, not from a neuroscientist, but from someone whose business involves words and language. Brought up in a bilingual home, speaking Greek and French, and also fluent in English, she is old enough to remember when her native language, Greek, was also in effect 2 languages. There was the formal correct form, katharevousa, which was taught and spoken in schools, written in newspapers and books, and so on, and the everyday demotic language you used with your friends. As for her view on bilingualism, she says that you end up with a split personality.
As I mentioned last week, we're going to look today at fiction writing, writing stories, and in particular at authors who have a reputation for creating characters in their books who are known as unreliable narrators. Now, what does that mean exactly? Well, originally in the 19th century, it tended to simply mean that, as a reader, you just couldn't trust what the narrator of a story was telling you. This might have been because they were not giving you important information, or because they themselves, as a character in their own story, lacked some kind of personal insight. In later works of literature, this unreliability was used by authors more deliberately, with the direct intention of making a story more complicated for a reader to understand, perhaps a crime novel or a thriller. Nowadays, there's a lot more humour in unreliable narration, and it's often used to make first-person characters enjoyable to read about. So, what all that tells us as a general starting point is that this type of narration
When you first examine something under a microscope, say a leaf from a plant, you're amazed at how much detail there is, and it's detail that you simply cannot see without magnification. And what you can see with the naked eye becomes suddenly huge under the lens. How big everything looks is astonishing, but it's also amazingly intricate. Suddenly, it's as if another world has opened up in front of your eyes, and you think, hey, I hadn't realized that something so small, so tiny, could be so
This is Scientific American's 60-Second Earth. I'm David Biello. Your minute begins now. On a visit to the Tampa area way back when, I enjoyed a stinging reminder that not all little red ants are benign. Introduced fire ants in the U.S. South are just one example of how ants from one region can set up colonies in another. South American so-called crazy ants now damage electrical equipment in the U.S., and super colonies of Argentine ants are all over Europe. To gauge such expansions, scientists, including Scientific American contributor Rob Dunn, tried to track introduced ant species in the Netherlands, New Zealand, and the U.S. They found that some 252 ant species have infiltrated the three places, mostly accidentally, for example in shipping containers full of fruit or wood. The researchers think their official count is low. They estimate the true number at nearly 1,000 species. And most can make a permanent home on new shores thanks to coming from nearby, climatically similar regions. The research appeared in the journal Biology Letters. Expanding their empires may be good news for ants, but maybe not for humans, as I learned all too painfully. Your minute is up. For Scientific American's 60-Second Earth, I'm David Biello.
This is Scientific American's 60-Second Tech. I'm Larry Greenmeyer. Got a minute? Our skin tells us about our surroundings by detecting temperature, pressure, and other external conditions. If a pot handle is too hot to touch, we can feel this heat before burning our hand. Robots may someday have this protection too. A team of researchers at the University of California, Berkeley, has developed a large area sensor network integrated into a thin plastic film that acts like an electronic skin. They demonstrated the concept with an e-skin sample about the size of a postage stamp that lights up in the specific places it's touched. The work is in the journal Nature Materials. The harder the e-skin gets pressed, the brighter the light. The researchers envisioned that flesh and blood users could have an e-skin smart bandage that monitors wounds. A large sheet of the material covering the wall of a room could even operate like a display screen, and a robot with such a surface could more effectively interact with its environment. Of course, we don't want our robots to be too sensitive. Then they might balk at cleaning up nuclear waste or spending years at a time alone on Mars.
I've still got the greatest enthusiasm and confidence in the mission.
Thanks for the minute. For Scientific American's 60-Second Tech, I'm Larry Greenmeyer.
A celebrated theory is still the source of great controversy. A group meeting will be held tomorrow in the library conference room. A massive accumulation of data was converted into a communicable argument.